Good morning. I'd like to start off with some housekeeping notes if I could. Today's session will be an hour long. If you'd like to ask a question of any of our panelists, please use the question and answer function at the bottom of your screens. The last 15 minutes of the session will be devoted to your questions, so please feel free to be as challenging to our panelists as you possibly can. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Amanda Newell. I'm the Director of Giving for the Ad Club. Now, generally speaking, the Ad Club tends to the minds and bodies of the advertising industry through our donations to NABs and to our scholarships to students, as well as the minds of the industry through our educational events like Out of Home Day and Newspaper Day, which is next Thursday. But today we're going to be tackling the industry's soul. So I was asked an important question when I was putting the panel together, and that question was, why do I not include a South Asian man or perhaps an Asian woman in the panel to create a balance? And while I completely agree that the voices of all BIPOC people need to be heard, the need to hear the voices of Black women is greater, that need is greater than it has ever been today. So when you look at the Canadian industry, we tend to think of us as Canadian people as being more tolerant than the average, but here are some interesting facts. In Canada, the women were given the right to vote in 1916, but Black women were not permitted to vote until the late 1940s. When you look at the advertising industry specifically, 7.54% of Toronto's population is Black, but only 2.24% of Canada's advertising agency talent is Black. And that has actually decreased in the last 2 years, according to an ICA statistic, which had the Black population represented by 2.9% of advertising agency talent 2 years before. So when you look at Black women, what I've learned over the past while is Black women are more likely to be sexually abused at work. They are more likely to suffer discriminatory practices and discriminatory disciplinary sessions. And to add insult to injury, a Black woman will make 83% of what a white woman will make, and shockingly, only 57% of what a white man will earn. So today, I bring you three women who have completely stamped upon those statistics, and they have risen through the ranks of the Canadian advertising agency system and the Canadian advertising world to become senior leaders in this realm. And so I'm proud to introduce Ishma Alexander Hewitt, who is the Vice President of Client Advice and Management at Initiative Media, Nicole Brown, who is the Senior Vice President and the Head of Investment of Amplify Canada, and Stephanie Byard, who is the Director of Media Sales and Agency Business at Rogers Media, as well as being the co-director of that company's, I never remember this, the co-director of that company's Women of Color board. So thank you all for joining me today. It's an incredible honor, as I think I've mentioned to every single one of you, to be here with you. This conversation actually came about as a result of a blog that Ishma created in the midst of the Black Lives Matter furor this spring. And it was an incredibly powerful piece that appeared in media in Canada. And in it, Ishma pointed out the fact that she has had to create what is known as an acceptable face to her white colleagues. She didn't want to talk about race. She didn't want to make herself stand out in that way. And so during the first conversation that this particular group had, we talked a lot about the authenticity of each of you versus the need to assimilate into the white culture of the Canadian advertising world. So I'm going to ask each of you how each of you has assimilated into that white culture. And Ishma, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks, Amanda, for hosting us and bringing us all together. It was interesting when I first put out the blog. I was just saying things that I had already been saying with my community and my peers of color previously, and we were saying it out loud. And I got a lot of responses, both from within the Black community and from outside of the community, all very positive. From within the Black community, it was, you've said what we've been saying out loud beyond our borders. And there was some thank yous, etc. But from with outside the Black community, it was a lot of, oh my goodness, I didn't realize, and I'm sorry. And there was a lot of surprise, which surprised me because I thought that I was just, calling out the elephant in the room, but realized that some didn't even realize that that elephant was in the room. So just before we jump into what we were doing, I think it's important to ground us all in a bit of context that will help people understand what we're even talking about. So really quickly, we all know 400 years ago, Black people and Indigenous people were displaced, Black people put into slavery for the purposes of economic gain. And that was rationalized with certain stereotypes and narratives that we're primitive, that we're not intelligent, we're not able to conduct our own society. And then if we rebelled against the work that was being forced upon us, then we were dangerous and aggressive and violent. And otherwise, if we didn't want to do the work, we were lazy. And that was the narrative, that was the rationalization, and that lasted for 200 years. And we know how long it takes to change perception of something as simple as a box of Kleenex, much less of a people, right? And then slavery ends, but that doesn't mean that the perceptions change or that the systemic racism changes. Slavery ended due to some pressure, but the practices continued in different ways. And I encourage everybody to watch 13th if they haven't seen it on Netflix. It's about the laws in America, but there's a lot of similarities with Canada as well. So, to your point, it's less than 100 years ago that we got the right to vote, and that some of these laws started to change. That doesn't mean that the perceptions or the narratives changed. And so if you have a people that are put into a situation where our socioeconomic status to begin with is at a disadvantage, and then you're dealing with systemic racism that's keeping you in those spaces, then you're going to constantly start to see the results of that pressure you put on a people, which sometimes will result in higher rates of whether it's violence or crime rates. You'll see that anywhere that you've got a group that is suffering from having a lower socioeconomic status. Doesn't matter what race, doesn't matter what country. But those are the highlights, because it's not everybody, right? It's a small percentage, but those are the highlights that then get picked up in the media and played back to us, whether it's through pop culture or through news. You know that growing up as a Black person. So when you enter the workforce, you already go in knowing that these are the thoughts that people are going to have about you. And it's not so much about assimilating to what the rest of the culture looks like. It's about suppressing pieces of yourself so that people don't start to get triggered by, oh, she doesn't necessarily speak with the same type of vocabulary that I do. She must not be as intelligent, whether it's a conscious or unconscious thought. So, entering the workforce and you're already carrying that with you. We know that school systems stream Black students into academic applied programs instead of academics. There's actually some research that came out just 2 years ago of white teachers and caregivers of children and their perceptions of different racial groups. And the Black and Indigenous groups both over-index almost by double for these same traits. People believing that we're lazy, unintelligent, aggressive, violent. So when I talk about assimilating, it's more about, I would never wear my hair curly because then people might think that I'm too much of a stereotype that I've seen. I wouldn't use Caribbean expressions. I wouldn't let people know that I grew up in a very poor situation, that I grew up in a single home family. And to start off, I started in the industry as a young single Black mother, so I knew I had an extra stamp that was already validating thoughts that people had against me. So definitely you assimilate a little bit, maybe you go to a hockey game, even if it's not your passion. I use that as an example. Maybe it is your passion, but for me, it wasn't, and it felt like it had to be. If people spoke about cottage country, I wouldn't speak, and because I had never been, and I definitely didn't debate some things as much as I would have or thought I should have, because I didn't want to be seen as the aggressive person and have that stick with me, and never wanted to speak up if I wasn't 100% sure that I was right, because if I said something wrong, then do I get the label of not being intelligent? Because that's already sitting under the surface. And then working really, really hard, ridiculous hours, just to prove that I wasn't lazy. So it's, assimilation is a small part of it, but it's really about suppressing who you are, in my experience.
Thank you. When I was doing some research for the panel today, one quote that I read that was quite fascinating was that racism can be seen on the streets of America, but it's felt in the boardrooms of Canada. So I think that's accurate, and I think it's an unfortunate accurate statement. I like to hope that is changing somewhat. Nicole, how about you? How have you denied your true self?
I think a lot of what Ishma said, it really resonates with me. The lessons learned about, being seen as lazy, being seen as unintelligent, those are learned really early. Like, those weren't lessons I learned when I started working. Those were lessons that, quite frankly, my parents instilled in me. You have to be prepared to deal with this potential outcome. Therefore, you need to work harder. You need to be smarter. You need to do better in school. The idea that you work twice as hard to gain the same, hopefully, was a lesson that, my parents instilled in me. So I think by the time I was at the point where I was entering the workforce, it had become how I was, because the whole idea of authenticity to myself, and it's a hard question for me to address, because for my whole life I've had to do these things. So to even know what would be authentic, like, I don't know. So it is suppression for sure, but it is, it's that the nurture that I got was about being prepared and preparing against those kind of judgments being made of me. And, and what Ishma said about thinking and making sure you're right before you speak, I am that way for sure. Is that my personality? Because I think I'm quite introverted anyway. Potentially that's a contributing factor, but I think there's also, it is a result of the lessons that I've learned, and I just I can't take the risk. And when I do take the risk, I'm incredibly hard on myself if I feel like I failed with that. Probably, I don't know if I'm harder on myself than other people, but I am very hard on myself when I've put myself in that situation. So, yeah.
I find it fascinating that the nurture you received. I think it's interesting that you were prepared for this world, and how terrible it must be for a parent to say to a child, you will be seen as less than, and this is what you can do to steer people away from that. That's shocking to me. Now, Stephanie, I've known you for 13 years, and I have to say the idea of you not being your true self is alien to me. But I know that you've made concessions. I know that you've tried to fit in. There are things that you've not said or not done. So tell me about those.
Yeah, I think what's really important to note here, and just how my experience might be a little bit different, is I'm biracial, right? I have a white mother and a Black father. So, I grew up with the oppressed and the oppressor. That was very much, my reality growing up. And those two things really played out on both sides of the family, but nobody did a really good job in the house explaining. Although they knew racism was afoot, although they were experiencing those things, it was never really talked about in my house, and so I, bounced out into this world and started coming up against all these things. So here I am trying to be my authentic self, and I'm getting a lot of confusing messages. I'm in a situation where, sometimes I'm accepted by whites, sometimes I'm not, sometimes I'm accepted by Blacks, sometimes I'm not. And there was always, as a child, and when you're growing up, you can't necessarily make articulate what exactly is going on, but you sense it, right? Like your intuition says something's wrong here. And I spent a lot of time observing, why is that okay for that person? But when I show up that way, it's not okay for me. So in terms of assimilation, I just want to make it very clear, like much to what this is years in the making. I'm still trying to figure out my authentic self. I'm still trying to figure out my place. Like since we've started having this conversation post George Floyd, it's the first time that, believe it or not, I feel like I have permission to actually explore the space. I actually feel like I have, resources and things available to me to actually understand a little bit more of myself. So I think the result of my upbringing led me into a place where I became hypersensitive, so to speak. And I don't mean sensitive in the way of like overreacting. Of course, I've done that, but I'm talking about always reading a room. And so it's funny because it's turned out to be probably one of my greatest gifts, but also, my biggest Achilles heel, right? Because I sense and I see everything. So I lost myself. And I just started through, whether it was being reprimanded, whether it was being told I couldn't do this or do that, like that's how I've moved forward. And so what I'm trying to do right now in my life is I'm trying to deconstruct all of that, call it assimilation. I mean, I guess you could, because I did what I needed to do to survive. And I so much echo what Nicole says. Like anybody who knows me knows how hard I am on myself, and I hold myself to another standard. Yes, part of that is me, but a lot of that is because I feel like I've been held to a different standard all my life. I just didn't understand why, right? So, yeah, it's really interesting, and it's still a work in progress for me.
Right, thank you. And I know also Ishma is also biracial, so that sort of dichotomy of the two sides of that world coming together and seeing one side and yet seeing the other side, it's a difficult thing to reconcile. And I appreciate your frankness there.
It is, and I'll just add really quickly to that it's interesting when we talk about the upbringing and the nurture, because my mother also was, I was 13 the first time she said to me, I got in trouble. I did something I wasn't supposed to do. And she said to me outright, you can't do that. You cannot do that. The world is going to judge you differently. And from that point, my aunt played a much bigger role in raising me, my dad's sister. My dad had moved back to Trinidad, and she would always say, I'm your father in this country. And she was the one who every weekend I was at her house. She taught me how to braid my hair. She taught me what I had to do and what I wasn't allowed to do. She helped me understand the rule book, and I needed that. So now I do that with my kids. So it is a hard conversation to have, but oh my gosh, I'm not going to let them go out into the world unprepared for it, because I know what they're going to face.
Yes, still shocking to me. Stephanie, you talked a lot about reading the room, and I know that Nicole, one of the most fascinating things that you said was, when we talked about this, was the idea that before anybody meets you, before you even in fact get to meet the room, assumptions are made just based on your name as to who you are. So that you've made up a game of mental bingo to count off the tiny little microaggressions that will be brought up during that first meeting by people that just assumed that you were white. So we've talked about those microaggressions, and we've talked about the debilitating effects that they can have not only on people's spirits, but on a Black woman's actual physical health. So can you talk about those constant small cuts and how they tend to keep, they can actually be worse than the blows of outright racism? So Nicole, please.
Yeah, I will admit I haven't played that game in many years. It was when I first started in the business, and there weren't a lot of other Black people in the business. My maiden name was Somerville, so you see Nicole Somerville. People would hear me on the phone. They had a preconception of what I looked like. So when they did meet me, there was often, I think people did try to hide it, their surprise, but it was always evident, not always, a lot of people were not successful in hiding it, and I would look for it. And you know, it kind of, I did laugh about it, but I think at the same time, it probably did reinforce the fact that I did need to, you know, prove, you know, their preconception of me switched from one side to the other. And I needed to prove that they can't stick with that second judgment, the judgment they would make when they saw me. So yeah, microaggressions, you know what, they're stressful. They can be very stressful. When it is overt, I mean, overt racism is also very stressful. But when it is microaggressions, you end up spending a lot of time trying to figure out the other person and figure out the truth of what they're thinking, which is, you know, it can take a toll. And if you're facing it all of the time, it really can, you know, I think from a mental perspective, it affects your self-confidence, your self-esteem. It doesn't allow you to, you're spending more time thinking about that than about, you know, the work or whatever it is that's actually pertinent. And it, I'm sure in many cases, people, you know, it might not be worth dealing with. You know, people might give up on opportunities because the stress of that, you know, over and above the stress that you face in work, it's too much. I can totally empathize with people who just say this isn't worth it. So yeah, I'm sure that manifests itself in a physical way at some point, but the mental stress and strain, it becomes so much more elevated than it should be.
Again, through the research, I discovered that in 2004, a study was done in the US that showed that Black people were much more likely to were actually 50% more likely to get an interview if their names sounded more anglicized than if they sounded Black. So I think, again, it speaks to that idea that you had to rail against this misconception. Now, speaking of these types of misconceptions, Stephanie, I know that when we were all talking about this, we talked about the fact that even though amazing strides have been made, they truly have in tamping down these misconceptions, that you would still all advise the next generation of Black women that they will have to fight against, or they will have to challenge these deeply ingrained stereotypes. Now, why is it that you think that, Stephanie specifically, why is it that you think that these types of stereotypes exist in what we always think of being a very enlightened and tolerant industry?
You know, Amanda, thank you. This is a really great question. And you know what? While we've made great strides, we still have a lot of work to do. You know, I think there's kind of two parts to the question. You know, why do they still exist and why is it tolerated? So maybe I'll just talk about the first. And I think Ishma did a really great job at hitting on a lot of these points. But I think it's important here to address the timelines of stereotypes and how they play out in our interactions on a daily basis. You know, as Ishma alluded to, we're talking about decades of widespread and pervasive stereotypes of Blacks. Many of the stereotypes created during the height of the transatlantic slave trade and were used to help commodify Black bodies and justify the business of slavery. You know, this is many years in the making. Stereotypes are learned, they're taught, they're passed down through upbringing and life experience. And as a result, they influence what or who we see. You know, the most prominent physical features that a person has, for example, their sex, their race. This triggers the most rapid categorization of groups. And once that categorization is kind of in your mind, you know what, and it's applied regardless of you know, that's who we see, regardless of how similar that person actually is to the stereotype or not. And the danger in this is that it really leads us to assume things that we might not actually see. And it leads us to make comments like, well, they're all alike. And it prevents us from seeing the differences that actually exist across people in a particular category because we're assigning all the characteristics or traits of that category to all the individuals who then become, labeled as belonging to that category. Everyone holds unconscious beliefs, and the use of stereotypes is actually a major way in which we simplify our social world. They reduce the amount of processing and the amount of thinking we have to do when we meet a new person. Like I too have unconscious bias, and no one on this call is exempt from this. Now, why it's tolerated, there's many reasons, but what stands out for me is just how much education and training is really needed still around unconscious bias, and the fact that it's so unconscious. And I think this training is needed so that our allies and leaders and friends and colleagues can stand up and start to interrupt these stereotypes when they show up. So when I think about, the Black women coming up in their careers, I think, there's so much more space now than there was for them, than there was actually for me when I started out, for them to show up as their authentic selves and have a voice and be who they are. But I think my caution in that is to them is one, they need to feel safe. And to everyone on this stream, whether you're a leader, a colleague, a friend, we all have a responsibility to create a safe space for our equity seeking groups. And my second point to that is that, I think I just want these young Black women, like, although great work is happening, we still have to be aware, and Ishma said this so well, of how long this has been happening. It doesn't just go away overnight. And until people actually, start to do the work around their unconscious bias, understand themselves, ask themselves questions about what their race, what it means to be white, what their race means to me, whatever race they are, and really ask those questions, understand what that means. I think that these will still have to rail against these stereotypes for some time.
Yes.
Add on to that. Sorry, if I could just add on. I think the fact that this has become such a topic at the forefront, and the way that the industry, agencies or whatever companies have embraced it and are actually trying to address it. Like, I don't think I've ever worked in an agency where race was a topic of discussion. It was always something you can't talk about for whatever reason. We could talk about women, we could talk about, sexuality, but it was never brought up to discuss race. And the fact that it is now being discussed is a huge step forward. I hope that it is not a trendy thing that will, next 2021, we move on to the next topic. I hope it does stay at the forefront, but the fact that it is even something to be discussed is a huge step forward. I echo Stephanie in that, Black women who are entering the industry and entering the workforce in general still need to be aware of, the pitfalls, I guess, for lack of a better term. But it does seem to be turning into a much more open and hopefully positive direction where we can start moving towards, the utopian world where race doesn't need to be discussed because it isn't an issue. But we're not there yet, but the door has opened, so.
All right, well, thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Stephanie. You talked a lot about the work that still needs to be done. And I'm so pleased to say that each of you work for companies where that work is being done. That work to dismantle systemic racism is being tackled. Those conversations are being had. Race is no longer taboo at Rogers, at IPG, at the Dan Network. So Stephanie, why don't you start by talking about some of the things that Rogers Media has done to try and to actually make tangible pledges to Black colleagues to say, this must change.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, you know what? First and foremost, I just want to applaud Rogers, and I want everybody to know this inclusion and diversity is not new to Rogers. This is something that we've been invested in for quite some time. But I think in the wake of the events surrounding George Floyd, it really gave us as a company, a real opportunity to take a deeper look at our strategy, our programs, and our progress so far as it relates to I&D. And so, using feedback from the safe talk and listening sessions that we had with employees, consulting with external experts, leveraging best practices, and reviewing our workforce data, we've actually reset our I&D strategy. And this strategy is grounded with concrete initiatives and goals and focuses on the employee experience, our talent pipeline, community investment, and of course, our customer experience. In July, you may have all heard that Rogers signed the Black North Initiative Pledge. This is led by the Canadian Council of Business Leaders Against Anti-Black Systemic Racism, which challenges senior Canadian business leaders to commit their companies to specific actions and targets designed to end anti-Black systemic racism and to create opportunities for all those in the underrepresented BIPOC community. We signed the pledge to help us accelerate the impact of our I&D strategy through initiatives and overall goals, including increasing Black representation at our VP plus levels to 3.5% by 2025. We've also recently partnered with the Black Professionals in Technology Network, otherwise known as BPTN, to recruit and support the career growth of top Black technical, digital, and business talent from across Canada in the tech industry. Amanda, listen, what I can say is Rogers is walking their talk. But most importantly, one thing I really appreciated about this process is that they were completely inclusive in this process and really included employees in these conversations that belong to these equity seeking groups. And I think that's super important, that we were able to have a seat at that table and have a seat at that conversation. And, I think we're all really feeling excited about the new plan and what this means for the future of all equity seeking groups at Rogers Communications.
Thank you. Thank you. That's remarkable progress. And it's wonderful to hear that it's been part of Rogers makeup for such a long time, and that it's just now just proceeding forward at an even faster rate. Ishma, one of the points that you raised in your spring blog was the fact that IPG Media Brands has always stood behind you as far as race goes, but that you were comfortable making these statements because you knew that you were working with a company that supported you. But please go on and tell me what IPG Media Brands has been doing in the last while to further that conversation.
Yeah, sure. No, I definitely had the support. I felt the support. It was scary still to put everything out there because you can't take it back. But it was actually the president of Initiative, Helen Glennis, my boss, who asked me, she's like, I saw your post on Instagram about George Floyd's murder. Do you want to share something with the agency? And I had been thinking about how I was going to approach it because I realized, as a leader, I have a responsibility to not have, if I can do something for the next generation that wasn't able to be done for me because there was nobody in my position who was in my agencies at the time, then that's a responsibility that is mine to make sure I take. So it's been amazing. We saw Black squares going into social media feeds and we signed pledges, and a lot of our conversations as a community was, this is great. This is awesome. Let's see if the rubber actually hits the road, and let's see if this is a fad or if this is something that people are actually going to undertake, because again, we're talking about centuries. This is for the long haul. And IPG has been great. We actually have two streams, you could say. There's the Black Employee Network that myself and some other senior leaders from across the network have started. We have our own action plan that we're developing with the support, though, of our ELT. And that's focusing on 3 areas where we think that we as senior Black leaders have a unique opportunity to help. One is to enlighten those who aren't within the community. And most of our senior leaders right now are not within our community. So how do we make sure, it's not our job to educate. We talk about that a lot, but we can't fix this unless we're communicating. And so we're taking a part in enlightening, and that's through workshops and forums and a bunch of other initiatives that we're doing with our senior leaders. Then it's what are we doing for the Black employees within media brands. And so spoiler alert to the Black employees at media brands, but this is about to be rolled out the actual community where there's access to mentorship and conversations and support so we can have conversations like these. And then the last sort of pillar is building up the pipeline. As we said, Black youth are streamed into trades and CYWs, and which are all good jobs to have. They're not the only jobs to have. So we're working with the TDSB and actually working to bring awareness of our industry and some different types of mentorship and exposure opportunities to high school Black students so that they can start to realize that these doors are open for them. And all of this is in concert with our larger media brands DEI initiatives that are really rooted in data. It's been a lot of work, right? This is all the research and the strategizing up to this point, but we've done sentiment studies to really understand not just diversity. It's one thing to know how many people work at the company. What you need to understand is how people feel. So that's the work that we've been doing is really, can you bring your authentic self to work? For all marginalized groups, we've had that come out. We're analyzing the data now, and that's going into 3 different work streams, the data. One is for people, one is for work, one is for community. So we touch on recruitment, mentorship, anti-bias training, hiring training, work around mental health. And what I'm really proud of is that we're also doing a work stream. So it's people first. We have to think about the people first, but we're in a unique position that we work in an industry that deals with perceptions. We deal with stereotypes, we deal with perceptions. How do we change people's minds on things? And so we're using that tool set that we have to actually create a work stream that looks at how can we help with not just the imagery, which is obviously more on the creative side, though as senior leaders, we speak up if we see something wrong, but also intentional investment. How do we support Black-owned business and communications? How do we make sure that the right messages are reaching the communities in areas where you feel that you're actually being engaged? So that one is one that I'm, besides the people first piece always, but I'm really proud that we're also looking at what we can do on a larger scale. So lots of things to come, lots of work going into it.
God, yes, it sounds wonderful, and I love the passion that you're speaking to with that about that. It's fantastic, and the idea that I gave that stat earlier about there being only 2.9% of Black people being represented in our industry. I love the fact that you're actually going at this from a high school level, because we need to talk about that. Not everybody needs to look like the cast of Mad Men in our industry. So I like that you're going to that group and saying, advertising is a possibility. Please think about it. We will welcome you. This is what our world looks like today.
Listen, my son is 22 and he is in Humber for mechanical engineering. And when he was in high school, some of the guidance counselors tried to push him to take extra geography classes. And I called the guidance counselor and I was like, what are you doing? He said he wants to take that tech class. It's like, well, I couldn't fit it in with his schedule. It's like, no, this is a blocking chart and I'm going to help you figure this out. You're getting him into that class. Yeah. And she's like, okay, fine, whatever you want. I was like, isn't that your job to make sure you're helping him realize what his goals are? Yes. She didn't see it that way. And she just rolled over. So, okay, whatever it is that you want, that's a problem. So we need to be able to help students in those situations whose parents might not know the system, know what their opportunities are to help move their kids forward.
Yeah, that's exactly it. The idea that their parents might, unlike actually all of you whose parents sort of prepared you for this world, there are many kids out there whose parents don't realize what this
don't know the system. You're new to the country.
Exactly that. So the fact that you're standing up and offering your assistance is remarkable. Nicole, you talked earlier about the idea of not wanting to see this be just a trend. How is the Dentsu Aegis network of agencies making sure that this is a conversation that keeps being had, keeps being at the forefront?
Yeah, Dentsu, I was quite happy to see the way that they stepped up. And it wasn't just a Canadian commitment. Jeff Greenspoon, our CEO, has been very much invested in, in the work that we have an anti-racism task force. And he's been very invested in the success of that. But it is also really clear that the commitment is global. And that has been really reassuring. so yeah, there, the action plan, the action team is very much focused on a lot of data collection, like a lot of the things that Steph and Ishma have mentioned. We are following the same path. We are trying to be systematic about it, to make sure that we have the right information before, the right information that is going to lead us to making the right decisions, with, a clear understanding that not every step is going to be an impactful and best step, but we're making the steps so that we can learn and iterate in a meaningful way. So, like I said, there's been a lot of data collection. We've tried to make sure that, allies have the right level of support, and that our Black employees also have the right level of support through hosting of like listening circles. Leadership should also have the right level of support so that they can make the right decisions, and not even just the right decisions, but to make a decision, when they're confused, not to sort of lean on biases that they might hold, like to really be thoughtful about decisions that they do make. From the high school representation, we've tried to focus on the talent that comes in and where that talent is coming from, and the opportunities that are given to those people, the talent within who are currently within our network, and make sure that they are getting the right support, and to understand when people do decide to leave, like to understand the reasons. If there is an underlying reason that is based in, in racism, that we know what it is, and we can address those kind of things. Another area is about community impact, and also with our clients, make sure that our client leads have the right resources so that they can provide their client with an educated point of view, and help guide them in the right direction in accordance with, their initiatives, so that they're reaching their customers in the right way, in a way that is supportive. So there are a lot of similarities to the steps that the network has taken. Steph mentioned the Black North Initiative. That is something that Dentsu was very supportive of from day one, and was helpful. We've been working with them on, strategy, media. They held a summit in July, which is where they got these commitments from business leaders from across the country. And we worked with them to get that summit, make it real in a virtual world. So yeah, that there has been a really strong commitment, which has been really encouraging. I think we have a long way to go. And I think, everyone who is part of the team and within the network knows that, but there's been a commitment to take those steps that are necessary to make a difference.
Thank you for that. Yes, the idea of tangible steps. And it's funny, you touched on something that I was actually quite surprised at, which was the lack of data around, the lack of Canadian data around Black women and their experience. And the idea that there isn't the right information to make the right decisions in terms of a Black woman's place in society, and making sure that Black woman's voice is heard. And I found that interesting, that I feel like we're a society that's consumed by data, and yet this data doesn't actually exist. So I think I find that utterly fascinating and scary. I have to say it's 10:44. I have 2 more questions to ask the panelists, and we've got a number of questions to ask that need to be answered from the audience, which I think are extremely important questions to ask, to have answered. And I wanted to say that we could go longer than 11 o'clock. It's not like this is going to shut down immediately at 11. I want to make sure that everybody gets a chance for their voice to be heard. So it might be that we go past 11 o'clock. Ishma, you participated in a roundtable around race in September. It was sponsored by Media in Canada. And I was struck by a particularly stark truth raised by Maxine McDonald. Now, Maxine is the Senior Director of Media Profiles, and she said that hiring is the lowest common denominator in dismantling racism in our industry, and that really spoke to me. But what can a company? You've all talked a little bit about what your companies have done, but it goes beyond not just what can be done on a corporate level, but what can be done on an individual level to create an embedded culture that gives people of color, and most specifically Black women, the safe space, to use Stephanie's statement, safe space to allow them to raise their hands. What needs to be done corporately and individually, Ishma?
I think corporately, some of the things that we all touched on that our companies are doing, information is key. As Canadians, we've been too polite, and probably because we just didn't want to really know and face the truth of the answers. So being able to run surveys, etc., I think is really important to help give people a chance to not just talk again about diversity. As they say, diversity is being asked to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. And it's about being within that actual community. And as the saying goes, equity is being part of the planning party committee, right? So that's where we need to get to. I think for me, one of the big things is mentorship is a huge part of this. If we're talking about individual, we've talked a lot about what companies can do, and happy to talk about that more, but I think mentorship is such a huge piece. I was lucky that within my career, I stumbled upon people who believed in me, saw something in me, and gave me some guidance. But that was a person here or there. There wasn't formal mentorship groups, and I definitely didn't have anybody of color that I could go to. And when I was an assistant, I turned in my resignation. I was going to quit the industry with a child and know where to go because of the amount of abuse I was getting from my boss at the time. I mean, ridiculous amounts of abuse. I can't even begin to tell you some of the stories. And it was the managing director of the agency at the time who said, "Oh, I know there's lots of problems with so-and-so. Listen, we're going to transfer you to somebody else, and I think you won't have any problems anymore." The person wasn't reprimanded. It was just acknowledged that it was toxic, and it was put into the HR record that it was a toxic relationship, but nothing was done about it. But the new person I went to was very down to earth and just a good person, and gave me more opportunities. But we can't rely on stumbling upon somebody or being lucky enough to have that person. There needs to be more mentorship. And the reality is the mentorship for this community needs to be broader than just the agencies that we're within, because we don't have the full amount of representation yet. So if I can talk to somebody at Dan, at Rogers, at any other company or agency, that's really important. So to me, I think there's a lot of individual things that are happening on a company level, and that's a good thing. But there also has to be some holistic, just this isn't about competition. This isn't about if my network is able to do it better than your network. This is about what is right for the community, and how do we open up those doors and make sure that we are cross-supporting. Because if you haven't been through the situation, you can support and you can be an ally, and allies are critical, but you're not going to be able to mentor in the exact same way, because you just haven't lived it. So we need to figure out how to do that. And actually, Maxine, after that talk, I ended up joining the board of directors of CoBlack, which is a communicator network that she and two others had founded. And so now we're looking at those types of things as well. How do we connect Black people within this industry so that they have a really strong support system? So I think it's conversations, honest conversations, uncomfortable conversations, and being open to working beyond the borders of your own company.
Thank you. I love the analogy of diversity being asked to the party and inclusion being asked to dance. That's fantastic. I may use that. To Ishma's original point, when you're looking at the power of authenticity versus assimilation, how have each of you been proud to showcase your authentic selves, and how does those expressions of your true selves, how will that translate to the next generation of young Black women? Nicole, I'll start off with you on this one.
Yeah, this, quite frankly, I think Steph was kind of saying it, like after George Floyd, this became like a big question for me. It got very emotional, it got really hard to kind of look at myself and like really dig deep to see what have I compromised on, what are those things? And I think, like, as I said at the beginning, that's when I became really conscious of the fact that the compromises that have been made in myself started very, very young. So, you know, I can look at how I act with my family or, you know, with some of my friends and compare that to how I act at work. And sure, there's differences. I think everybody has that. You know, what is my authentic self? What am I comfortable with? What am I not comfortable with? I've had to dig really deep. And I don't know that I have all the answers, quite frankly. I think, you know, I try to just be me, but is that me, you know, the true me? I find it to be a really tough question to answer. I feel like it was compromised early, and recovering it is going to take a lot of work for myself.
It's interesting. I think both you and Stephanie have touched on this being an ongoing process, being the fact that you're never sure who your true self is. So Stephanie, how have you sort of joyfully showcased who you really are these days?
I completely echo everything Nicole said. And I think I said it earlier, this is still a work in progress for me, but you know, when we started out, I've really thrown myself into a lot of I&D initiatives at work. I really just try to look for those safe spaces, right? Those safe spaces that really promote that conversation, that promote that inclusion. And for me, you know, one thing that I know has always been authentic about myself is that I really care about maybe justice isn't the right word, but being somebody who grew up and experiencing nothing but exclusion, it's become kind of part of my fabric, right? So being able to be a part of, you know, I&D at work and sitting on in the employee resource groups that I work in. So I do Rise for Women. So next year in 2021, I'll be the chair of Rise for Women at Rogers. And yeah, I'm super excited about that, and, you know, still continue my work with Rogers Women of Color, but that's kind of where I'm taking myself right now. And I'm really trying to, that's where I'm really letting my authentic self shine. I'm actually very fortunate because I work with a leader who, you know, I've worked with for quite some time, who, when I think about my journey, has probably been one of the most supportive, and just has always kind of supported me and encouraged me. So there's a lot of space, and she always has kind of showed up in an inclusive way. So there's a lot of space for me to be authentic and be who I am. And that a part of that is speaking my truth, speaking up, which I tend to only do before in comfortable settings. But, you know, she's always really little loud. She's always really promoted that. So, you know, I'm unlearning everything. I'm trying to figure out what I've compromised. I'm trying to take risks, take a little bit more risk, take some steps, you know, in larger settings, so that I can be that example for others. And, you know, just really throwing myself into the inclusion and diversity work. So, you know, those are just things that I'm doing. I don't know if it really speaks to how I'm showing my authentic self. I'm really just trying to figure out what that is, and really trying to contribute in those safe spaces where I feel that I have the space to figure that out and bring that out and feel okay with that, and not walk away and be stewing at night going, oh my God, what did I just say? Or am I going to be, you know? So that's kind of where I'm at in this whole conversation, but completely echo what Nicole says. Still a work in progress. It will be for a while.
I understand that. And it's interesting that you mentioned your experience with Janice Smith at Rogers Media. Being a, I know, well, I wanted to shout at her, give her a shout out for being amazing. But to sort of, to put that experience versus Ishma's experience with a leader who was no leader, and diminished her, versus Janice, who has given you space to grow. So Ishma, in showcasing your true self, does it make you a better leader to that next generation? How have you?
100%.
Yeah, absolutely. No question at all. And just because I want to be hyper clear, that leader that was terrible was in my very early days, and not Helen, who's been the opposite. And it was interesting because when Helen did promote me to a VP, and I started joining the SLT meeting, she pulled me aside early and said, the you that I see when you're in front of clients or when you're with your team is not who I'm seeing show up at the SLT meetings. What's going on? And she was the first one to really spot it and call me out on it. I wasn't being myself. It's like, okay, I guess I have permission to do this. If I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it right. So it's been a journey for the past few years, I would say, since moving to initiative. But I feel like right now I'm going a bit back to my roots. George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd sort of flipped a switch in me. I've got a 22-year-old son. He's got cornrows in his hair. I have a 14-year-old son. He has autism. If he has a meltdown on the street and he's considered dangerous to somebody, is he at risk? Like, I don't know. All of a sudden I was like flipping the table. I'm like, that's it, forget it. I'm putting it all out there and there's no turning back. And I have a 7-year-old daughter who last year was asking me if she could straighten her hair so she could be pretty like me. And I've been doing that for years just to fit in. I was like, forget it. So I'm growing out all the relaxer and going back to my roots. And even though my aunt, who I call mom, like she's my mother, she would say to me, you know, you have to work harder, you have to do this, etc. She never told me to not be myself. She's the opposite. She's so outspoken. So now I feel like I'm going back to my roots a bit and being like, you know what? I'm going to be like mom. I'm going to say whatever it is that's on my mind in whatever way that's authentic to me. But I would say having these conversations and making myself uncomfortable, making a point of making myself uncomfortable is what I'm trying to do to just keep inching forward. And one of the other big things that woke me up, I think, was seeing some of the junior talent come into the agency Black, and they were wearing their hair natural. And I was like, you know what the hell am I doing if I'm straightening this just for everybody else? But these girls already have the bravery. Let me not show them that they should change to what I'm doing. Let me be a role model and do what they're doing. So they were an inspiration to me as well in that space. So just keep being uncomfortable, and I think we'll inch along.
Yeah, and I think that was when we first started this conversation, we knew we wanted to make people feel uncomfortable. We knew that it wouldn't be a comfortable chat. We're not going to say that everything is better. But I think you've certainly given a way to a way of light. There are lots of questions, as you can imagine. This has certainly generated a lot of comment from our audience. So I'm going to get to a few of those right now. I'm going to address a few comments because they've been really fascinating as I've watched everything come through. Teresa has this comment to you, Nicole, where she says, "Oh my God, only speaking when I'm 100% sure that's what I do. I hadn't actually thought about it before as suppression. I do attribute it to being female as well, and always concerned of how I'm perceived by the men in the room." And I think that's fascinating. And then she goes on to say, "It's enlightening to hear others say the same," and thank you. Brian has a question about how we can best exert pressure on changing hiring practices. Is it a human resources issue, or is it just pressing Canadian media CEOs to implement top-down change versus just talking about it? And I think a few of you, in fact, all of you have talked about how it's no longer just to be talked about, that it's something that Canadian media CEOs are implementing. So I think I do believe we've sort of gone into the details on that one.
If I could just quickly address that. I think it has to be a corporate culture, adjustment. It has to be made clear that, within a network, within an organization, it is not acceptable for leaders to not demonstrate that this is what they are the standards that they're trying to hold their teams to. I think if you don't have that, you won't ultimately have change. I think that is really, if you're going to look for a long-standing impact, it has to become a part of the culture that this is a very important, it's a very important issue to address and to make sure that diversity, equity, and inclusion is, table stakes as part of an organization.
Truly. Sandra asked, and I'm going to direct this one to you, Steph, because she asked, do you find that the issue of stereotyping more prevalent with men or women in the business world? Which is interesting because that gets into sort of sexual mores as to our likelihood of stereotyping. What do you think?
No, thank you for the question. Listen, I don't claim to be an expert. And so for a question like that, I'd actually would tend to lean on stats if there were any. From my experience, I feel that there's more stereotyping against women. Like, I look around at a lot of the Infinity and employee resource groups that, many companies have, and it's either, for equity seeking groups or women. I would just say in my experience, personal experience, I would lean more towards that being prevalent against women, not so much men. But again, I can't factually speak to that. My apologies.
No, the personal experience is incredibly valuable here.
Nicole, I've got one. That, but I just want to say quickly, I think there's stereotypes against men as well. But the issue, that, as I see it in my perception, is that right now the standard of what is the right way to be in business and the right way to get ahead and get results aligns with the stereotypes that come with being cis male. And I feel like the stereotypes that a lot of us other marginalized groups are dealing with are working against us. But at the same token, if you are not that stereotypical cis male, that can also be a challenge for that person, right? If you're male and you're up against that. So I feel like it's just what the stereotype is and what we've decided the standard is.
And I completely agree. Now, it's funny, I believe, Stephanie, you alluded to statistics earlier. We've certainly talked about statistics. Maran has a question regarding data. And Nicole, I'm going to put this to you because it's, have your companies always collected data regarding race? And if not, how have you encouraged employees to self-declare in order to be able to have the necessary data to look at representation at various levels in the country, in the company? Nicole?
Yeah, that's a good question. Certainly within Dentsu, it's something that we have struggled, maybe a hard word, but to some extent, yes, it struggle with. It wasn't data that we collected on our employees. We have been trying to work with them to self-identify. And to be frank with you, we don't just need Black employees or BIPOC employees to self-identify. We need to see what the full the full population looks like, so that we can know what the figures actually are and build an action plan around that. So it has been challenging. We've worked with leaders. We've tried to appeal to the employees in order to participate. But it's an ongoing challenge that we have been working on. We haven't quite found that silver bullet yet, but it's something that we're looking to find.
All right. Yes, silver bullet would be wonderful, but it seems unlikely. We have so many questions and so many wonderful and supportive comments here that I'm going to ask maybe Alan and Manuel, who are our IT and helping us on this call, to perhaps, if you wouldn't mind recording the comments and questions for us so that we can answer them. Because again, I want to make sure that these are all answered. There are some fantastic thoughts here. I'm so encouraged, and I'm sure the panelists are as well. So as not to keep you all too much longer, my final question is this. Do you see hope for our industry? Ishma, is there hope that things will improve?
We're having this conversation, and a year ago, I would have laughed you out of the room. We never would have had this conversation. So there's hope. And the fact that it's November, 6 months after the murder of George Floyd, and we're still having these conversations, and we're talking about work that has been done over the past 6 months, which is, this is the long haul, right? But we're seeing people are actually starting to put in that work and understand that, and people are amazing comments and questions. I absolutely have hope. I absolutely have hope.
Thank you for that. That's wonderful. Nicole, when you look at some of your amazing Black colleagues like Cassandra James and Shadae Randall, can you look at them and say to them, there's hope? My past will be very different from your future.
Yeah, honestly, I would hand over heart say that I absolutely believe that for them. I do think there's hope. I do love the fact that addressing these issues, and I don't want to say nobody, but I haven't seen anything where anyone's looking to slap a Band-Aid on it or, you know, sprint to make people feel happy for the moment. People are looking at it as a marathon, you know, a need for longstanding change, and that gives me a lot of hope. That wasn't on the horizon. And, you know, even before this, I will say it is something I've noticed where you go to an industry event, you know, if I were to compare the population at an industry event in my first year to, you know, my whatever year this is, there's a huge difference. You know, it's not like the population of Black representation hasn't been growing. It has. We just want to make sure that the right doors, all doors are open for them. They feel comfortable stepping through them, taking an opportunity, making the choice not to take an opportunity, like that, you know, those options should be there for them. And I think we're on the path to making sure that it's there for them all.
Thank you. Thank you. And Steph, while yes, your journey is certainly ongoing and you're a work in progress, do you see, I mean, I think we can all agree that the industry is also a work in progress. So do you see hope?
Yeah, I mean, look at, you know, where we are today having this conversation. Someone's hope got us here today. You know, I think to have hope is to want an outcome that makes your life better in some way. And I think all these panels, safe talk and listening sessions, conversations, the investments that our leaders, companies are making in our communities and in their, you know, for their employees, and the fact that people are joining together, you know, with kindness and compassion. And I think the fact that people want change gives me hope.
Yeah, thank you for that. As the panelists know, I'm a biracial woman who has denied her South Asian heritage for decades. And I have to say that I'm very proud of my brownness today. And so I thank you, each of you. We've talked a lot about the courage and the eloquence that you've brought to this session. And so I thank you for that. And I thank you most of all for being your authentic selves and bringing those authentic selves to this table. And I also thank the audience for, again, so many questions and comments. They've been so wonderfully supportive. And let's make sure that this conversation continues. It's an uncomfortable one, but let's get to the place where it just becomes commonplace now. It just becomes something that we acknowledge and that we try and do better. So thank you all. This has been a fantastic session, and I celebrate each one of you and all of our audience today. Thank you, and I will hopefully continue this conversation with you all later.